few words on cultural intelligence model, one of the models that we use here at the International Center in our intercultural communicative competence training and global competency training. So cultural intelligence is a person's capability to function effectively in a variety of cultural contexts, both internationally and domestically. See, in our own cultures, we usually have an idea of what's going on around us because we have a wealth of information, much of which is subconscious. This helps us make sense of what we experience and observe in our interactions. When we interact with individuals who are different from our cultural background, the same cues may mean something entirely different. The challenges of cross-cultural leadership go beyond scheduling virtual meetings across time zones and an occasional faux pas or misunderstanding. The impact of intercultural communication challenges are at the core of whether or not we can successfully meet our performance objectives. And this is where cultural intelligence comes in. It helps us effectively adapt our leadership strategies when working outside of our own culture. And cultural intelligence said it's a set of capabilities and skills that enables leaders from outside of a culture to interpret unfamiliar behaviors and situations as though they were insiders of that culture. Cultural intelligence it's a concise model that stems from rigorous academic research done across the world, and the findings consistently demonstrate a strong connection between leaders' cultural intelligence and their effectiveness in reaching their performance outcomes. Rather than expecting individuals to master all the norms, values, practices of various cultures they encounter, cultural intelligence helps leaders develop an overall perspective and repertoire that results in more effective leadership and intercultural communication. So for example, in culturally unfamiliar situations, sometimes other people's behaviors and perspectives seem somewhat bizarre or random. Those with a high level of cultural intelligence have the ability to encounter these types of confusing situations, think deeply about what's happening or what's not happening, and make appropriate adjustments to how they understand, relate, and lead from there. Making these kinds of adjustments involves a complex set of capabilities and processes that come from intentional effort on the part of the leader. And all of that contributes to the leader's cultural intelligence. It can be learned by anyone, and it offers leaders an overall repertoire and perspective that can be adapted in those situations, like I said. What we're going to be looking at are where the US and Germany fall on different continuums. As we look at values and where they fall on a continuum, our culture teaches us preference on each continuum. Our value preference may fall anywhere on a continuum. Although we can move along that continuum somewhat, we tend to have a preferred place of where we're most comfortable or to which we turn when there's times of stress. We also have learned behaviors that are attached to our preferred values on that continuum. We can have different values and exhibit the same behavior. For example, family may be a value for two people. One person demonstrates that value through the nuclear family, and another demonstrates it through extended family. We can also have different behaviors to support the same value. For example, two people, they work hard to make a lot of money. For one individual, the money is used to support the value of long-term security for one's family, while another person may use the money to support a value of material success. We tend to see a behavior and immediately jump to an interpretation or an evaluation of a behavior without first adequately describing that behavior. If we see a different behavior or suspect different value, we cannot know what that means without asking the other person. So We recommend using an approach of describing the actions or behaviors, interpreting what that behavior could mean, and then placing an evaluation on it. So describe, interpret, and evaluate. One more note before we get into looking at US and Germany specifically. It's important to note that intent and impact are not the same. We may exhibit a behavior with a very good intention, but it may have a negative impact on the other person. For example, if we call someone by his or first name with the intent of being friendly and inclusive, and if that person has a different cultural perspective, our friendly gesture may be experienced as an insult or as disrespect because he or she expects to be addressed more formally as Mr., Dr., Ms., or Professor. Similarly, someone may behave in a manner that has a negative impact on us. And for example, someone might ask, why don't you have children? And our natural inclination is to be offended and to want to say it's none of your business. But the safest assumption is that the person's intention is good. Effective intercultural skills include sharing with others the impact their behavior has had on us and asking them to help us understand the intent. Asking about their intent without sharing the impact that it's already had on us, which allows us to revise the impact. And then stating our own intent before acting when behaviors can have multiple interpretations. And lastly, seeking a wide range of interpretations for behaviors before negatively interpreting it. In other words, we're going to avoid premature judgment. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and look at a few dimensions of culture here. 8 dimensions of culture, starting with communicating. On one end of the continuum, we have low context communication. In low context communication, good communication is precise, simple, and clear. Messages are expressed and understood at a face value. Repetition is appreciated if it helps clarify the communication. On the other end of this continuum is high context communication, where good communication is sophisticated, nuanced, and layered. Messages are both spoken and read between the lines. Messages are often implied, but not plainly expressed. We look at where US and Germany fall on this continuum. You see that they're both on the end of the low context communication. The US being a little further to the left than Germany on your screen. So what we tend to see, the general observations of where countries fall on this, and more diverse countries like the United States, it has a lot of variety in its background. Low context communication is key because of the lack of shared history. In the case of Germany, where you have more of a shared history, then there's going to be more room for implied meaning in this. One of the things as we go through these different dimensions, oftentimes people confuse this communicating with our next dimension of evaluating. We're on one end of the continuum, we have direct negative feedback, where negative feedback to a colleague is provided frankly, bluntly, honestly. Negative messages, they just stand alone. They're not softened by positive ones. You may be familiar with the feedback sandwich. Absolute descriptions are often used when criticizing, and criticism may be given to an individual in front of the group. On the other end of this continuum, we have indirect negative feedback. In this case, negative feedback to a colleague is provided softly, more subtly, diplomatic. Positive messages are used to wrap negative ones. Qualifying descriptors are often used when criticizing, and criticism is only given in private. So here's where we see kind of a swap in position, with Germany being to the more left on your screen towards giving direct negative feedback. The US has moved more center here. Again, in the US workplace, often we see that feedback sandwich where you'll give a positive feedback, layer in your criticism, and then follow up with another positive attribute. Moving on to our next dimension here, leading. On one end of the continuum, we have egalitarianism. The ideal distance between the boss and the subordinate is low. The best boss is a facilitator among equals. Organizational structures are flat. Communication often skips hierarchical lines. And in the hierarchical end of the continuum, the ideal distance between the boss and the subordinate is high. The best boss is a strong director who leads from the front, and status is important. Organizational structures are multi-layered and fixed, and communication follows set hierarchical lines. Let's take a look at where the US and Germany fall on this end of the spectrum. Here we have the US on more of egalitarian end, Germany on more of the hierarchical end. I've received a lot of feedback on this placement here. In some instances, in terms of the relationship, especially between boss and subordinate, and different communication styles. People tend to disagree with the placement of Germany, but one of the things that I would point out is when we talked about organizational structures are multi-layered and fixed, right? So the US, we tend to be, to use a colloquial, willy-nilly, that we can have different kind of structures for different situations. And the Germany context, the fixed order is important in terms of the structure. And even when we do have different communication between boss and subordinate, it still follows a mutually agreed upon structure. Looking at our next dimension, deciding. On one end of the spectrum here, we have consensual, where decisions are made in groups through unanimous agreement. And then on the other end of that spectrum is top down, where decisions are made by individuals. Usually that's going to be the boss. And here we see that swap, where and then Germany being more on the consensual side, US being top down. Again, as we talked about, the kind of difference between the power distance of the egalitarian and the hierarchy. Here we see that when it comes to decision making, the US has more of that hierarchical process of decisions being made at the top and making their way down. Looking at the value of trusting, we have task-based. Trust is built through business-related activities. Work relationships are built and dropped easily based on the practicality of the situation. You do good work consistently. You're reliable. I enjoy working with you. I trust you. In relationship-based end of the continuum, trust is built through sharing emails, evening drinks, visit at the coffee machine. Work relationships are built up slowly over the long term. I've seen you at a deep level. I've shared personal time with you. I know others well who trust you, so I trust you. As we see, this is one of these areas where the US and Germany more aligned on the task-based, meritocracy, and your trust is built on the reputation of your work as opposed to your relationships. Looking at disagreeing, on this end of the continuum, confrontational, disagreement, and debate are positive for the team or the organization. Open confrontation is appropriate and will not negatively impact the relationships. For those cultures that avoid confrontation, disagreement, and debate are negative for the team or organization, an open confrontation is inappropriate and will break group harmony or negatively impact the relationship. Here we'll see Germany much more open to disagreement, where you have disagreement or criticism. It's not a criticism of the person, more of a criticism of the work, and that those receiving that criticism are able to compartmentalize and not take it personally. So here in the US, we see we're more to center, typically going to try to avoid confrontation or use that kind of indirect negative feedback approach to showing if something is not agreeable to us. Scheduling. Anybody that's worked US, Germany, you can probably guess where we'll fall in this line. On one end of the spectrum, we have linear time. Project steps are approached in a sequential fashion, completing one task before beginning the next, one thing at a time, no interruptions. The focus is on the deadline and sticking to the schedule. Emphasis is on promptness and a good organization over flexibility. Those that work with flexible time, project steps are approached in a fluid manner. Changing tasks as opportunities arrive. Many things are dealt with at once and interruptions are accepted. The focus is on adaptability and flexibility is valued over organization. We see Germany falls on the continuum, just about as far to the left as any other country in the world, with emphasis on the project planning, timelines, planning for the long term. All right, and our last dimension we're going to look here is persuading. Principles first, individuals have been trained to develop the theory or complex concepts before presenting a fact, statement, or an opinion. The preference is to begin a message or report by building up a theoretical argument before moving on to the conclusion. Conceptual principles underlying each situation are valued. On the applications first, individuals are trained to begin with the fact, statement, or opinion, and later add concepts to back it up or explain the conclusion as necessary. The preference is to begin a message or report with that executive summary or bullet points. Discussions are approached in a practical, concrete manner. Theoretical or philosophical discussions are avoided in a business environment. This is an area, one of the greater distinctions between Germany and the US. So on the US, that far right end of the spectrum, applications first. You see our bullet point or presentations or bullet points. I may give you our organizational's rank or our products rank without comparing it to the greater industry and lacking the theory built up behind it. Thank you, Colin. That's the dimensions of culture. If we still have a moment, be glad to take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Peter, for taking the time to present all of that material. So just as a reminder, please feel free to use the chat feature if you do have any questions for Peter. But just to get started, Peter, what are some of the ways that Americans can be more mindful and learn more about a culture?
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of coming back to that cultural intelligence, one of the key things is to have the drive. We need to be motivated to learn about cultures and develop our cultural intelligence knowledge. So our tendency is to, again, to use a colloquial phrase, wing it. But if we can do more research into the protocol and etiquette, seek out cultural consultants, whether it's the Indiana Germany Business Council or colleagues that have that experience of working in Germany, to know before you go. Oftentimes we hear from people that they learned it while they were there. So we want to be prepared and go in with that context before we arrive into the engagement.
Wonderful. So we do have a question. Andrew asks, do you see any cultural dimensions changing in the near future between the US and Germany, or are they fairly static?
They're fairly static, especially as we look at the research that's done over the histories. It's important to note that there is cultural relativism in there, and that as we look at culture, beyond these national comparisons, which are just super stereotypes that help us give us the best first guess. But there's going to be variations within each culture, and there's going to be variations within the people that we meet. But leading from a position of going with that best guess, and then as we plan to go into those situations, that we check our assumptions and then adapt based on the individuals. Is the best approach, but there tends not to be a lot of movement in those places as we're looking at national culture, especially in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And Peter brings up a good point. A lot of the times, culture is fairly static, but one of the considerations is kind of the generational gap. So very much like in America, we talk about millennials having different viewpoints than baby boomers and Generation X. So too, it like other cultures and other countries where the younger generations may have different priorities, but overall, stay fairly static. I have another question for you, Peter. So you've worked with a lot of cultures over the years. So what stands out about Germans to you?
It stands out, particularly I've had a German boss for, I think, better part of the last decade. One of the things that stands out, I think it really comes back to the communication, being able to interpret, communication, especially as we're talking about direct negative feedback or indirect negative feedback, is that you got to be able to check your interpretations of the message and that you're receiving there. So when you do get that direct feedback, that you're able to adapt your response in those situations.
Wonderful. Christoph Egel, did you have a question?
Actually, thanks, Colin. Actually, I just wanted to comment on the question about how static cultures are. Peter talked about the national culture, or the country's culture. I've seen business cultures often vary, and depending on how large international an organization is, your German counterparts may have learned a lot through their international interactions and may not display so much of the nation's or the country's culture and more of a corporate culture that may be more American than one might think. So while the overall culture, the large numbers probably won't change very quickly, smaller entities may display different behaviors.
Thank you, Mr. Egel. So we have another question in the chat for you, Peter. If there are 2 to 3 tips on engaging between 2 cultures for positive interaction, what would they be?
we'll reiterate one is it's all in the preparation. That don't go in with the assumptions, especially in the work that we do in protocol. There's a lot of research involved trying to understand the people that we're engaging with before we make that first contact. The other would be knowing when to adapt. There's loose cultures and there's tight cultures. If you're engaging with the tight culture where they have those shared values and norms that are consistent across most members of the society, that's a situation where you're going to want to adapt to those customs and cultures. And if it's looser, then you can be be more yourself, right? But still understanding that there's different protocol and etiquette where there may be some exceptions, but other times where you really need to follow the rules.
Wonderful. So I'm going to have a last call for questions for Peter before we move on to our panel discussion. So if you have any last questions, feel free to enter them to the chat or forever hold your peace. Seeing that we don't have any, I would like to thank Peter again for taking the time to present on the cultural considerations between the US and Germany. Thank you again for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
All right, well, wonderful. So we are going to transition a little early into our business panel discussion. And here to join us are Esther Sandlin, attorney at Dinsmore, Martin Baier, president and CEO of the International Center, and all the way from Germany, Christoph Egel, partner at Fortium Partners. So thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Just to get us started, if I could have each of you take maybe 1 to 2 minutes to articulate a little bit more about yourself and your Indiana-Germany connection. So Martin, if you'd like to get us started.
Happy to do so, Colin. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Peter's boss for the last decade, as he said. So I'm originally from Germany. I spent 22 years in the German military, and that brought me over to the United States, and where I received training from the US military. Also was stationed here for 3 years in the US with liaison function to the United States Air Force, the Pentagon. But even more so, I'm married to an American for 32 years. And you think that I've all figured it out and be the expert on cross-cultural relationship between the United States and Germany. Totally wrong. So I'm still learning and I'm still running to my challenges, and I'm happy to share more later on. But in my day job, as Colin said, I'm the president and CEO of the International Center.
Martin is also my boss too, so that's always another thing to consider. Esther, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Esther Earbin Sandlin, and I am an attorney here in Indianapolis. I'm originally from Indianapolis, but I spent nearly 6 years living in Freiburg, Germany, in the Black Forest. In addition to Freiburg, I also spent a year in Tübingen teaching at the university for a fellowship. And while I was in Freiburg for that time, I was also teaching at that university and also working with the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Criminal Law, now the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security, and Law. A big part of my time in Germany while working with these organizations and teaching in the university was teaching about law, studying German and US law, comparing the two systems as it relates to areas such as data privacy, intellectual property. In those topics I use a lot in my practice now. And then also I was in the business of raising a teenager. So my daughter still lives in Germany. So I am very connected to Freiburg, and also culturally, not only living there as an employee for a German quasi-governmental institution, but also as an expat. So I have fond memories of trying to integrate or just make my way through the German culture as a resident as well as a professional.
Well, thank you, Esther. Really appreciate you being here. Christoph, how's the weather in Germany today?
Actually, I can tell you, Peter, because I made it back to the United States.
Oh, you're back now. Great.
And I can tell you that Florida was very wet this morning.
Oh, there you go.
My name is Christoph Egel. Good morning, everybody. I am originally from Germany, as you can surely tell by my accent, but I've been living and working for more than 25 years for American companies and here in the United States. I'm currently a partner at Fortium Partners, which is a IT service as a leadership as a service organization, providing CIO, Chief Information Officers, Chief Technology Officer, and Chief Information Security Officer services to companies that have a leadership need for a variety of reasons. I, as you might imagine, started my career in Germany working for a large German conglomerate, Linde, for many years before joining General Motors in Europe as the IT executive for Delco Electronics, originally from Kokomo. They asked me, after several years working for them in Europe, to join them here in the United States on an expat assignment as their Chief Information Officer, where I spent the next 8 years, and then I left Delphi, had a number of CIO assignments with Tempur-Pedic, with Remy, just north of Indianapolis, with Cooper Tire just recently as the acting CIO in Ohio. And in between, I actually held a CEO position for the American subsidiary of a small German nutrition company. So a number of international experiences working with Germany, working with other countries around the world in executive leadership positions. And I'm more than happy to share my experience here with you. Oh, and maybe I should add, like Martin and like Esther, while I'm married to a German, so I don't have the multicultural experience there, I have two very much American kids that speak German with such a deep American accent that it's really funny.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, let's get started with you, Christoph, then. First, I should also mention that we do want this to be a fluid Q&A session. So participants, if you do have any questions for all three of our panelists, feel free to enter your questions into the chat. But I really, really like this, Christoph. Some people say that Americans are like peaches and Germans are like coconuts. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Actually, we learned this when we were trained in multicultural training for our expat assignment. And it's reflective of the fact that when Americans approach new relationships, strangers, they are very open, very outgoing, very friendly. My best example is if you are in a restaurant and the server addresses you, they call you hon, they actually talk with you as if you are their best friend and that you have known each other for a long time. In Germany, it's much more rough, if you will, much more distanced. So this comparison with coconut and peach is reflective of Germans having a rougher outer edge. They are more distant in their initial engagement, in their initial reaction compared to Americans, which have a very soft skin and then a very hard core. So for Americans, you actually penetrate to a number of layers of very friendly interaction, very soft interaction, and then you get to a hardcore where Americans let very few outsiders in. Germans are different. You are initially held at a distance, but when you penetrate this outer hard shell, you are on the inside, and it's a very soft, engaging relationship. You may have heard that Germans often think about Americans overly friendly in a first interaction, and are suspicious about this friendliness. I don't know you. Why are you asking me those questions? I think Peter gave an example like that. While Americans think of Germans as rough, crush, unfriendly, often on a first interaction. And that's because of this, cultural approach, if you will, to interaction with strangers. So, nothing negative about it, just something to recognize. And I would not advise anybody to change your approach. Just be aware, be cognizant that the immediate reaction may not be the same as you might receive from an American in a like situation. It may be a little bit more distance if you, go to approach a German with both arms open, immediately going into a hug, if you will, metaphorically speaking.
No, I think that brings up a good point to, be considerate, do your homework, but also be your authentic self.
Mhm.
So Esther, you had mentioned that you had lived in Germany for 6 years as an American. So can you tell me a little bit more about what that was like and maybe some of the challenges that you had faced?
So when I went to Germany, the idea was that I would stay for 1 year. And I failed miserably at that idea for many reasons. I think it was new culture. It was a new experience for me, and I really wanted to stay. Now, it was not my first time in Germany. It was actually my third time visiting the country, but there was a connection that I had not only with the culture, but with my colleagues, my new colleagues that I met at the university in Tübingen before moving to Freiburg. So the challenge, the major challenge, as one who has been to Germany or had interactions with Germany as a foreigner, is of course the language. So the language was something that was not as easy for me to pick up, but it was fascinating, and I became really interested in learning German. And once I started learning German, I started getting so much support from German colleagues who quickly became friends. And I felt like I was better able to navigate through Germany. And so this is what inspired my pursuit to stay a bit longer. My daughter also had the same experience. But another interesting aspect of my time in Germany was the structure of the law. So as I mentioned, when I first arrived to Germany, the purpose was to teach as a part of this fellowship. So I had the opportunity to work with the law faculty, specifically the criminology department at the University of Tübingen. And as I started teaching students about American law, started having other conversations with colleagues and students regarding the differences between the systems. This was incredibly fascinating, and also further helped me understand the culture, not only language or the way the society worked, but how people thought about the rules of society and what rules should be. And so in my quest to learn more about this, I reached out to many different people, professors and German professionals, to learn more about laws in Germany, and really took on this pursuit to understand the culture through its laws, but also to understand the culture in my interactions. And this led me to understanding more about German business. I had a great opportunity to work with different businesses while there, either as a consumer or just being curious about the structure of an organization and the business that they did as it related to the areas of law that I was researching. And in that, kind of connected to the language, it was very challenging at first to understand certain cultural norms of communication. as Christoph mentioned, the essential American way to build relationships is to be very open and friendly, to be in some ways vulnerable to establish a connection. However, in a lot of interactions that I experienced with Germans, especially German professionals at the level of or in the university, as it relates to respect, there's some of these things you must kind of get past before you can get to that coconut center, if you will. For example, there's the Z and the do in the language, the nature of respect. I don't know you as much very well, so I'm not going to use this form of the German language that is a little bit more relaxed. I'm going to establish respect in that regard. This is not only speaking and communication, but also written communication. Sehr geehrte Frau oder Herr or Herr, Mr. and Mrs. These are things that I quickly realized not only were forms of respect, but help to get to the point of building a relationship. And I thought that was something that was useful to understand and also navigate through German culture. The other thing that I thought was really helpful is titles, professor or doctor. That helped me also understand the education system a bit. A lot of German professionals, regardless of which area you can think of, whether it be law or business, pursue a doctorate, a lot of them. So the title of doctor is just as important as the title of Mr. And if that individual is also a professor, using the professor or the professor doctor becomes even more important. And I don't want to say that as a barrier, or that is something that makes interaction with German professionals seem intimidating. It was just understanding the way or some of the commonalities that helped make a connection to individuals that I worked with in Germany. And eventually that initial respect allowed me to build some very close personal and beneficial relationships in both my work as well as my personal life. So, that in a sense was, that in a sense was extremely helpful for surviving that short time, even though I look back, it seemed very long, but it was a very short time.
I know that's a wonderful advice, especially understanding the formalities when it comes to doing business with German. So in that respect, Herr President Baier, so you were ex-military and obviously moved from Germany to the US. So I'm curious, what was your biggest challenge as a German expat coming into the US workforce?
I'll give you one example. As I said, and as you mentioned as well, is I thought I have much experience in working across the cultures and then the time that I was stationed here and working with the U.S. military and everything that goes with it. But I think that one of the challenges is, and that's kind of like also as an example for U.S. participants today, but then also our colleagues from Germany, is in the communication style during a business meeting. Because here in the United States, if you're in a discussion, if you're in a meeting, everyone is very talkative, and you see that during those talks, people really don't wait until the other person is done with their point. They step over each other, don't wait until they're finished, and there's hardly, if not at all, a moment of silence. And for someone like myself, where English is not the first, English is the second language or even the third language, people forget here that for an expat or an immigrant, there's also a translation process going on that, where you have, or myself, have to kind of digest the points that are discussed or the things that we're talking about, and then, try to set myself up to contribute to those discussions. And by the time you think you're ready, you know, it's already someone else is talking. So there's really, you know, quite often not a moment where we could participate. And in the first years when I came here, it was very prominent where I noticed I've been in a meeting for like an hour and I haven't said anything. And I talked to other experts too, and they said, you know, it happened to me as well. And the U.S. teams here and the U.S. colleagues quite often interpret this as a, you know, as a kind of weakness. Maybe that person has nothing to contribute during that meeting or the discussion, or they're not knowledgeable of the topic. But that's not the case, as I've mentioned. And so having that awareness on both sides. So for myself, of course, you know, be more prepared and kind of, you know, adapt to the situation and now be able to express myself and being part of those discussions and conversations. But then also for the US colleagues here and team members, you know, keep that in mind, that the many international and also working with the German counterparts, that there's a different communication style where, you know, everyone has their time to speak, and then there's that polite second of silence where everyone is waiting. Is that person done? Maybe they, you know, say something else, and then the other person, you know, starts talking and contribute to it. And I talked to some of the US companies here that have team members in Germany, and they said, yeah, we've seen that too. You know, our colleagues in Germany, when we have conference calls in the past or even Zoom meetings nowadays, that they don't actively participate. You know, again, maybe we don't have the right people. They're not really, you know, part of our team and maybe not the experts that we thought they are. And so I talked to the German team members, and they expressed the same, and said, you know what, we hardly get into it, and you know, we would like to, you know, participate, but we need to find a form to do so. And one of the solutions is, if you go into those meetings, and you know, for some of the companies here that have German team members or talking to the German counterparts, is, you know, have an agenda and which allocated time for each and every individual in that meeting to have, you know, the time to share their topics, their you know, contribution to the discussion, and that you know, was very helpful. So again, that mindset of the different communication style in settings is, you know, quite often related, that you know, for our counterparts around the world, and if we talk here about Germans, that again, you know, English is not necessarily the first language, and although the English is overall good, they still need some time, and there's a different communication style.
And Martin, you bring up a really good point. You know, avoiding that ambiguity and being very specific when it comes to business meetings and kind of the tasks at hand, and, you know, outlining an agenda and a process is very important. So we do have a question from one of the the participants, and this is open to all of our panelists. So can someone share a story of a change initiative? So think of changing the way of working, implementing a new system or a process. And were there any conflicts or misunderstandings from this, and any strategy to approach cross-cultural initiatives?
Let me take a step at that. Actually, as a matter of fact, one of the interactions I just had with while I was in Germany was with a fellow chief information officer who's been working for a number of German mid-sized companies, small enterprises, multi-billion dollars. And when I told him about this panel and, you know, was looking for some feedback he could provide me, he was actually telling me about how difficult it is to drive change in Germany and the approach to take, and especially in the smaller organizations, not the super large multinationals, international companies. Change is not something that comes easily. I actually remember reading in a British newspaper years ago that watching change in Germany is like watching grass grow. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of listening. It takes a lot of understanding where individuals may sit with regards to their opinion, their position, their fears. We often hear that Germans seem to be risk adverse, and that's one of the examples where risk adverseness comes to fruition. It's when change is introduced, and when change has a personal impact. Personal impact in terms of the future of an individual, or a personal impact to how the work is done, how it is conducted. And his feedback, his advice was, listen very carefully, understand where those concerns come from, and think about what can be done to take each individual along the journey for this particular change. And you have similar challenges here in the United States when change becomes personal. So I'm not sure I would contrast this too much in terms of adversity to change, but the approach is slightly different. The German mind, the German approach is much more analytical. It's much more carefully planned, while the American approach tends to be a more pragmatic approach to introducing change. I remember a conversation at one of our board meetings when I was at Delphi about fast-paced culture change. How can we accelerate change? I'm not aware of any of these conversations in German companies. So I hope this answers the question to some extent. It's not a particular example, but it's a little bit more a general experience of how difficult it is, how long it might take to introduce change. And then, oh, by the way, the decision-making process itself is longer. There are much more consultation. There is much more consultation along the way. And there are institutions, if you will, like a works council, who have to be heard when decisions are made.
Well, that's wonderful. Doing a quick plug for the International Center, that is actually one of the things that we do here, is to help advise companies when it comes to working across culturals and making sure that cultural considerations are understood so that no issues can arise from that. So let's move a little bit more into the business sphere. And Esther, since we do have an attorney here with us, could you give us some free legal advice when it comes to legal considerations when working in and with Germany?
Well, I can't say that I can give free legal advice, but I can give you some experience. So one of the things that I think is most important for businesses and entrepreneurs or professionals to consider when doing business in Germany is looking at the legal landscape. What laws would be important to your business? Specifically, if you're doing business not just in person but online, keep in mind that not only Germany but the European Union may regulate things that you do and the transactions that you have in mind, especially as it relates to something, for example, like data privacy. You have the GDPR, which is not specific to Germany. However, it is extremely important to the European Union, and it can not only impact your business, but also your profit. So the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. And what it is a series of regulations or a part of European Union regulations that regulate how data is processed, used, collected, stored, and anything you can think of. And a big part of understanding the motive behind that is also understanding a little bit about the legal landscape in Europe. And Germany is our biggest example. privacy, the right of people to share information, or the control people have over their information, is very important. So where we might be quick to send a lot of introductory or cold emails in Germany to introduce ourselves, our business, to start to build relationships, first of all, you might get a lot of skepticism as to where you even got my information. And if you got my email from something or someone else, why are you using it for this purpose? These are things that I think are very important to consider as by way of communication, especially email communication. Another consideration is looking at doing business and where you would like to utilize the law. For example, with contracts, what would be the governing law of that contract? Would it be Germany? Would it be the US? There's very different implications for both systems. So I think those are some things to also think about. If you're looking to engage German lawyers, I think it's really important to consider the experience of the German lawyer. One of the biggest differences between the way lawyers are educated in the US and Germany is that in Germany, lawyers start their education at the undergraduate level. So as soon as they leave high school, they start studying law. And that program may be 4 or 5 years. Then they might get a PhD, but they also take their exam and they can be licensed after that undergraduate degree. One of the things that is important, or one of the areas that comes up in is as far as experience, that in the US, we tend to have a degree that covers any amount of topics before we actually start studying law. So, for example, my degree, my background is in fine arts. So to have an artist then go to study law is not something that you'll find very often in Germany. And so that can make a big difference as it relates to certain conversations, how lawyers come about starting their career and giving advice. And it's just also very interesting to start engaging the legal system, is understanding that experience. It doesn't mean that they're more or less experienced in the area of law. It's just a very different way that law is approached and taught. So those are just some initial considerations that I would have. Definitely data privacy, I think, is key. If you're going to do business online, you should definitely understand what the GDPR is, at least know those letters. It's not anything else. Get started Googling those 4 letters, GDPR, and understanding how privacy and data is discussed, because it's a very important issue. A lot of times written in the German Constitution is about autonomy. And so that's going to be very important as to how you do business, and then how you either protect your business from claims against you, or how you better connect with your potential German clients and our partners.
GDPR is such a huge thing, and it can't be understated, the importance of doing your homework before you are actively engaged in a business relationship with Germany. There have been several instances, actually, of folks in the EU who, for lack of a better term, are internet trolls, and they regularly look at American-based websites that do not have the GDPR regulations up to date, file complaints on them, and then they get fined for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for violating EU GDPR. Even though you may not have any active business in Germany, it's still something that is incredibly, incredibly important. So we do have a question from the chat, which reads, do you have any recommendations for US colleagues who regularly work with colleagues in Germany to educate themselves on how works councils impact more global decisions that impact Germany, when work council should be engaged, etc.? So if any of our panelists would like to talk a little bit about Works Council, that would be wonderful.
I can again try to take a step at it, not that I'm by any means an expert. But if you're already working with a German organization, I would start there. Your counterparts in Germany should be aware of what particular interpretations their local works council has. There are laws and rules about works council involvement and engagement. The German HR department would know about that, and they probably have some information, albeit they are probably in German, not in English, so somebody would have to translate this for you, and I would not trust Google Translate. There is probably a whole session we could have about different interpretation of colloquialisms between the two different languages and misunderstandings or non-understandings as a result from that. In general, the Works Council has pretty broad rights when it comes to any employee decisions and any changes to work practices that affect an employee or the educational or training requirements of an employee, shift changes, things like this. And then there are others where the Works Council has to be heard, but not necessarily has direct influence other than providing an opinion in the decision-making process. Boards of directors usually have, in publicly traded companies, work council representatives, if you will. So I suggest you actually talk with your German counterparts because work councils in different companies act differently. You might have an environment where the work council to business management relationship is almost hostile. And you might have others where it's really friendly. And I've experienced the latter while I was still working in Germany. There were some confrontational situations. And oh, by the way, the work council representatives are elected. And like all publicly elected officials, they have to cater to their audience so they get reelected. So, in other words, the relationship isn't always a perfectly collaborative one, because in that case, the colleagues might not see themselves adequately represented. And oh, by the way, there are also unions in Germany, which play a very different role from unions in the United States when it comes to the direct engagement in an organization. Often, at least in my past experience, work council representatives are also union representatives, because that gives them the platform to run for the representative job. It's probably enough said, given that I started with, I'm by no means an expert, and I'm quite far removed, but it's one of those aspects that's often overlooked and then may catch you when you think you are in implementation phase and suddenly you have to go back to the drawing board.
I think you said it very well, Christoph. And so the Works Council, actually going back from the long tradition in Germany to have unions. But nowadays, they don't necessarily be part of a union, but pretty much each and every company, from small to, of course, the large ones, have one way or one form of a Works Council and the workforce representation within the leadership, or at least very close to the leadership, and within larger companies, even on the board of directors. And each and everyone might have different responsibilities and different authorities. So it's really a case-by-case study. And for you, Kimberly, you asked that question is, to looking into the German counterparts or the company that you're already working with, and then maybe, as Christoph said, reach out to their HR department, their general counsel, or the general counsel on the US side here, to look a little bit deeper into the roles and responsibilities of the work council and the representation of the workforce with the company that you're working with.
All very good and important points. So I'm going to take a little bit of a liberty here, as a moderator MC, to ask a question that I have. In a previous life, I did a lot of work with Chinese businesses, and it was very clear The Chinese definitely have much more of an entrepreneurial spirit, always trying to think ahead of the curve, looking at business opportunities in the forefronts. But now, working with a lot more German companies, it's clear that they are a little bit more risk averse. They're a little bit more maybe slower to the receptive changes when it comes to this global business connections and supply chain issues that we have. So I'm curious, Christoph and Martin, what are some of the challenges that you see that German companies face when coming into the US market?
Martin, do you want to start?
I can start. So some of it, and there are prominent examples of failure. But as I think, Christoph, you mentioned it earlier too, is quite often the different perspective of doing business. And it's an example for that in Germany, the development and the production of certain goods or so, it's a longer process. And in comparison here to the United States. So in Germany, for example, the development and manufacturing, it takes a much longer time because the philosophy is quality, while here in comparison, in the United States is time is money. So everything in the process of, for production of a certain a product or even how to provide a service, it's all by the face of quality driven. That leads to the longer development process and the planning that goes with it, and the Germans always ask the question of the what ifs. And so not only have their regular plan in place, but then also considering in the development the alternative. So what if something happens down the road? We need a plan B and ideally a plan C if plan B doesn't work. And here in the United States, when you talk to the companies and businesses here, then of course the attitude and the perspective is we address those problems when they occur down the road. And also another one is that with the longer planning and development process, what is included is also that the documentations and the manuals will be written and have to be ready before the actual production or the service starts. And again, here in the United States, as we all know, it's we create those along the way. So quality takes time and makes the product also more expensive because of that. And again, here it's driven by time is money because we know here we might lose the customer if we don't deliver on time. And actually they go then maybe to one of the competitor that sells for a lower price. So be aware of those different philosophies. In Germany, kind of like seen as perfectionist, and from the German side, they see the United States more as improvisers. And for a German US company, they must find a way to address it, either compromise, but that's normally not as good because it would take away from one or the other. And most of the time it would take away from, again, of the quality. There's a certain reason why people, want that product. And another form is maybe then the communication to the customers here and the target audience is about the why. For the US company here that maybe represents a German company or is waiting for the goods to come from Germany for the US customers here, is let them know, why it takes longer, why there's a process, and why it might be a little bit more expensive than some of the US built products here. But as we all know, for many people here, if you like a German car because of the quality, you accept the longer wait and the higher price that comes with it. And but again, that compromise and finding the median where both sides, works for both sides. Again, the longer process, but then also the faster turnaround that is necessary. There's one example, as we all know, in the mid 2000s, of a merger of Daimler and Chrysler, and then here in the US and even in Indiana with the factory in Kokomo, and after overall a very short period of just a few years, they found out that the approach of the production and the philosophy is so different, and many other problems too, but that was one of the key issues, that the whole process of development, which they wanted to combine here in the US and back in Germany, is on completely different timelines, and there was no way for them to find a medium and a compromise, and it led to the failure and the separation of the two companies again.
Very good. Christoph, do you have any other thoughts on that?
My initial thought is I should have gone first. It's almost impossible to follow Martin on this very comprehensive explanation. German companies often think if I make it, somebody will come and buy it. So it's very product centric. If the product stands out for itself, it will represent itself, it will advertise itself, and people will buy it. So my take on what Martin just said is it probably works both ways for American companies operating in Germany as well as try to understand the market, try to understand the consumer. German companies probably fall short to a larger extent in understanding who their buyer is and how to approach the buyer, be it the consumer or in a business-to-business relationship. If I experienced this as the CEO of the small U.S. subsidiary of the small nutrition company, that the approach that works very well in Germany does not necessarily work well in the United States because the go-to market is very different. The consumer reacts very differently. And I just recently joked about the fact that I have no clue of how the American consumer reacts to certain situations because they manage to surprise me every single time. And I'm not sure that's representative for all Germans. But understand the market. And I think that's one of the largest challenges, or understand who your buyer is, who your consumer is, and how to approach them most effectively. And maybe that translates into this cultural communication topic in general, because if you have an idea in a business environment and your consumer of this idea is a German colleague, try to put yourself to the largest possible extent in their shoes and try to understand how they are looking at whatever you're proposing, a process, a change, a product, a technology, an approach, or the product you want to sell into the market. And let's make sure that the approach actually works in the other culture, in the other environment.
Wonderful. We have a question from Howard, and Howard, give my best to your wife. Howard says he is a college instructor of German language and culture, and was wondering if the panelists had any thoughts on what might be most important to teach students to prepare them for working between the US and Germany. Are there things that the panelists wish that they had learned in their studies? So maybe we'll start with Esther and then see if Christoph and Martin have any other thoughts.
Yes, I first think that the students are on the right track with studying German, the language and the culture, taking a class to understand what they can expect. I would have liked to better understand the concept of bureaucracy and the processes, government processes, and the time that they take, because I think, and I don't want to represent all Americans, but I tend to be impatient. And I think that's because I like how fast things work here. And if things don't work fast, then someone might say, we're working on it or we'll get to it. And that's not necessarily the case in Germany. There is very much a process for everything. There is very rarely the chance that you can as we might say, quote unquote, go above someone's head and have a decision made. You very much have to be patient and understand the process behind, for example, a visa. And if your students are going to be going to Germany to work, that is one of the most important things, is to understand the time and the process behind some of these key things that relate to their interaction, because that requires planning. And I think one of the things that can be most surprising is how poorly one plans when they don't know how things work. So understanding government processes such as official certifications, visas, what needs to go where you need to go, I think is important just in general. And I think that's something that I wish I would have known more about and understood. I still wish that I understood it to this day. As of 2022, I was still learning this very difficult lesson. But I think it would be it would be good to at least start a dialogue about that if they're interested in working in Germany or between Germany and the US.
And I think that's a great point, Esther. Having worked with several American companies that have operations in Germany, one of the things that a few business owners have said is they would like more of a focus on business German, like the language of business German. I remember one business owner had said, I don't care if you know Goethe, I don't care if you know the culture, I want you to be able to understand the engineering language, the business culture, things like that. Martin, Christoph, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what you just said, Colin. I took some notes here too, what I'm going to say, and there's something similar. It's really kind of an introduction for your students, and how, and you probably do this already, to the business language, and that can be done in, with reading some business journals. They're all available nowadays online, and have them, read those in German, talk about it, and have it digested. As you said, we hear it from some companies. Just knowing that the language is not enough, but we need people to be experts on technical terms. And then, of course, later on, even more in different fields. We all know there's a difference between medical technical terms and law and other areas as well. But I have to say that worked for me. So in my last 2 years, while I was still in the military, I went back to school and took cross-cultural classes, but then also English language classes. And I didn't have that. And at the beginning, when I was in the early 20s and received a year's training here in the United States, I had all the British English, and we learned a lot about Shakespeare, but I wasn't able to order French fries at McDonald's because no one told me that, what the right term is, French fries. So, preparing for real life situations early on, and also with in addition to it, with some cross-cultural training. I know that probably the schedule do not allow to have that much doing the studies, but it could be in form of bringing a guest speaker into one session and talk a little bit about the cross-cultural aspect between Germany and the United States, similar to what we have done earlier, because then that is very helpful, and also prepares then the students to not just do a simple translation, because a translation you might not have the right understanding what that means if you want to translate it from English to German, or vice versa, if you read something, if you do not have the cultural background that goes with it.
Yeah, a couple of additional thoughts. First of all, Esther, if you ever figure it out, I have some German friends and colleagues who would love to understand how German bureaucracy, not just in government, but in institutions. Let's talk about banks and the experience my wife and I made over the last 3 weeks with regards to our German accounts. They are equally as bad. But that's certainly true. And then from a technical terminology perspective, I wholeheartedly agree. It's so easy to misunderstand each other just because each party thinks they know what the others talk about, but there is no exact translation for the term, and both interpretations are easily incorrect. But my answer actually would be that there is no substitute for spending time in the other environment. So I would say that if somebody is serious about learning a different language, learning about a different culture, spending time there can't be substituted by anything, because you have to experience it. And that's not just a vacation trip or just a short overseas 4 weeks with a class. It's actually spending a semester there, living there, interacting with the individuals. So my suggestion actually would be, look at what partner universities you have in Germany, and look at how can you engage in exchange programs, and then maybe even in between, since we are all working remotely right now and interacting with video conference, maybe some shared courses with a English class in Germany or an English business class in Germany, and have some shared assignments between the German students and the American students on both sides of the Atlantic, and have them work together and make the first-hand experience. Because what I've learned over the years, not just working as a German in America or as a German in Paris, working with General Motors lawyers in Detroit, but working with Asians there is no substitute for the first-hand experience and interaction, ideally consumed while there, observing it and experiencing.
Wonderful. Well, one of the most important things about Germany is promptness, right? So we are nearing the end of our panel discussion, but I wanted to give all of our panelists a chance to chime in on a last question that I have. So if each person wants to give maybe a little bit of advice or homework for our Americans that are tuning in today, what should they do to learn more about Germany, German culture, or German business?
I can start. I think one simple thing that would be helpful is staying in touch with the news or a media outlet. I recommend Deutsche Welle or dw.com. It's often in English. Just getting some initial insight into what's happening in the country by way of news. Also, dw.com has German language resources that I think are very useful and helpful for English speakers. And just even that small thing, you can even find Deutsche Welle on Spotify. Just listening to some of the news that's happening either in English or in German is a good start. So just getting connected to the country by way of seeing what's happening over there. I believe there's even a section for business. Just get started.
I can go next. So first of all, congratulations, because you did the first step being in this session here, and I hope it was somewhat informative. But the other thing is, as I mentioned too, is using all opportunities. Again, nowadays with the internet, there's so many resources and tools available. But if you really are serious that you want to start doing business in Germany, or you think or you have a business meeting coming up and it is very important, then also seek some professional help as well. I can mention the International Center, but I don't want to do a promotion here at the moment. And but there are other resources as well, because there's no excuse of not being prepared when you have the time to prepare yourself.
I'm actually really struggling with providing an answer to that, short of, book your flight, go over there. For those of you who are already interacting with German colleagues in business engagements, I would suggest to schedule some extra time trying to understand each other better, where you're coming from and where you need to go. That's, as we discussed earlier, potentially difficult in a purely business-focused, tight agenda meeting. So, spend the extra time with your colleagues. There are organizations like the German American Chamber of Commerce. There is a chapter in Chicago. They have quite a presence. And you should always check into those German American organizations available to you to learn more. And then I don't want to be too liberal here with our calendar, but if any of you have any particular questions, I'm sure that I don't know if our email addresses are out here and available, but I'd be more than happy if you have any specific questions as it relates to Germany, American business relationships, or personal experience, or if they happen to be in the information technology realm, I may be even more competent to answer those, and I would offer that as well.
Well, that's the perfect segue, because we will be sending an email with everyone's email addresses out, along with the survey and some more information about how folks can stay engaged. And so the best answer to how to stay engaged to Indiana Germany business is to be a part of the Indiana Germany Business Council. So thank you again to all of our panelists for taking the time today and to give their wonderful insights into the US and Indiana Germany business relationship. So thank you again, and look forward to seeing everybody hopefully in November when we have our first virtual Germany business conference. So until then, please feel free to reach out to us if there's anything we can do for you. Tschüss.
Tschüss. Ciao.
Tschüss.
Auf Wiedersehen.